There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that make you question your own sanity. I'm about to share something that happened to me that I've never told anyone before. A story about a neighbor who died decades ago, but never stopped watching, never stopped guarding, never stopped waiting for someone to take her place. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though I can hardly remember what a normal life felt like anymore. It was October 2021 when I moved to 43 Maple Street. The housing market was crazy, and when I found this beautiful Victorian home at half the price it should have been, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The real estate agent was suspiciously eager to close the deal, practically throwing the keys at me once I'd signed the papers. I should have recognized that desperation for what it was, a warning. The first few days were perfectly normal. I was busy unpacking, arranging furniture, and trying to make this old house feel like home. My neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I noticed they never walked on the sidewalk in front of the house next door, number 45. They would cross the street, walk past, then cross back. At the time, I chalked it up to small-town eccentricity. It was on my fourth night that everything changed. I'd been having trouble sleeping, partly because of the creaks and groans old houses make when they settle. At exactly 3:27 a.m., I remember the time so clearly because it would become burned into my mind. I went downstairs for some water and sleeping pills. That's when I saw her for the first time. The moonlight was bright that night, casting long shadows across my kitchen floor. As I reached for a glass, movement caught my eye. In the second floor window of number 45, there was a face. An elderly woman, her silver hair meticulously styled in a 1950s fashion, wearing what looked like a floral dress. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. Milky white, like cataracts, yet somehow I knew they could see me perfectly. Being new to the neighborhood and not wanting to seem rude, I raised my hand in a small wave. She didn't respond, didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was an insomniac like me, or perhaps she was just checking on some noise she'd heard. The next morning, I decided to be proactive and introduce myself. In the daylight, number 45 looked abandoned. The paint was peeling in long strips like dead skin. The yard was overgrown with weeds reaching up to the windows. All the windows were covered in decades of grime, except for that one upstairs window, which was impossibly, pristinely clean. I knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. As I was about to leave, my next-door neighbor on the other side, Mr. Peterson, came out to get his newspaper. "Trying to meet Margaret?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of, was it pity? "Yes, actually. I saw her in the window last night and wanted to say hello." The newspaper fell from his hands. "Son, that's not possible. Margaret Wheeler died in 1983. They found her still sitting in that window where she'd been dead for days. Nobody's lived in that house since." I laughed, of course. Told him he must be mistaken. I saw her. But Mr. Peterson just shook his head and invited me in for coffee. Over the next hour, he told me Margaret Wheeler's story. She'd moved to Maple Street in 1952 with her husband, George. They were happy at first, by all accounts. But George died in Vietnam in '65. And something in Margaret changed. She became obsessed with protecting the neighborhood. started the Neighborhood Watch program, installed one of the first security systems in the area. But it wasn't enough for her. She began spending every night at that window watching, recording, documenting every movement on the street in detailed journals. If a car drove by too slowly, she'd call the police. If children were out after dark, she'd call their parents. If a stranger walked down the sidewalk, she'd follow them with binoculars until they left the street. The neighbors complained, but Margaret was convinced she was keeping everyone safe. Evil only wins when good people look away, she would say. Her behavior became more erratic over the years. She started calling the police dozens of times a day, reporting suspicious activities that existed only in her mind. Then, in the winter of 1983, the calls suddenly stopped. After 3 days of silence, the police did a wellness check. They found Margaret still sitting in her chair by the window, dead from a heart attack. But her eyes were open, still focused on the street below. And clutched in her hands was her final journal entry. They think they can hide their sins from me. But I'll never stop watching. Never. Even death won't keep me from my post. This street needs its guardian. And I swear by all that's holy, I will never abandon my duty. I didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. But that night at exactly 3:27 a.m., I woke up with that feeling again. The weight of eyes upon me. And there she was, in that same window, wearing that same floral dress. Watching. Always watching. I tried everything to escape those eyes. Covered my windows with blackout curtains. Slept in different rooms. Even spent a few nights at a hotel. But I could still feel her gaze, still see her silhouette when I dared to look. And always, at exactly 3:27 a.m. My obsession with understanding grew. I spent days at the local library going through newspaper archives, old town records, anything I could find about Margaret Wheeler. The more I learned, the more disturbing the story became. During her years of watching, Margaret had filled 47 journals with her observations. The police had confiscated them after her death, and they painted a picture of a mind unraveling, or perhaps seeing things others couldn't. She wrote about shadow people who only came out at 3 a.m., about neighbors who weren't quite human, about evil forces trying to infiltrate her beloved street. But here's the thing that truly chilled me. Some of her observations had been proven correct. A serial killer arrested in 1975 was found to have stalked several houses on Maple Street. Houses Margaret had specifically warned the police about. A ring of burglars caught in 1980 had been casing homes she reported as being watched. Even after her death, crimes on Maple Street were surprisingly rare compared to surrounding areas. As months passed, I started to notice patterns in Margaret's appearances. She wasn't just watching me. Her head would turn slightly following other neighbors. The businessman who I later discovered was embezzling millions. Margaret's eyes would track him every night. The babysitter who was stealing from her clients, those milky eyes would follow her home. It was as if she could sense guilt, could see the darkness in people's hearts. I started keeping my own journal, documenting her appearances, the patterns, the neighbors she watched most closely. Sometimes I could swear I saw her nod slightly when I wrote in it, as if approving of my efforts. Last week, something changed. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret wasn't in her window at 3:27 a.m. Instead, I found a note on my kitchen table written in faded ink that smelled of lavender and dust. You understand now, don't you? Why this street needs its guardian. Someone has to watch. Someone has to see. Someone has to protect. You've learned well these past 2 years. The window is yours now. Take your post, guardian. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Instead, I found myself drawn to that window in number 45. The front door, which had never opened for me before, swung wide at my touch. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed them, drawn to that room, to that window, to that chair that still sat there waiting. The view is perfect from here. I can see everything, everyone. I understand Margaret now. This street needs its watchers, its silent guardians, its eternal sentinels. We see the darkness trying to creep in, and we keep it at bay with our vigilance. They say if you drive down Maple Street late at night, you'll see us both now. Margaret Wheeler and her chosen successor keeping our eternal vigil. So mind how you walk down our street. Mind what you do in the shadows, because we're always watching, always guarding, always waiting for the next guardian to join our ranks. And if you ever feel eyes on you in the dark of night, just remember, some neighborhoods have alarm systems, some have police patrols, but Maple Street has us. And we never sleep. We never look away. We never stop watching.